Across multiple ancient and early imperial systems, diplomacy was not only conducted through treaties and envoys, but also through the movement of human lives, particularly women of elite or semi-elite status who were transferred between courts as part of political settlements. Historical records indicate that what later observers sometimes describe as bride offerings was rarely a ceremonial gesture in the romanticized sense, but rather a structured mechanism of statecraft in which marriage, concubinage, or court placement functioned as instruments of control, alliance, and surveillance. These arrangements were embedded in the broader logic of ancient governance, where loyalty between states was often reinforced not through written guarantees alone, but through the physical relocation of individuals whose presence symbolized submission, cooperation, or enforced peace. Contemporary accounts from various regions of the ancient world suggest that these women were not simply symbolic figures. They often came from royal households, aristocratic families, or politically significant clans, and their transfer was tied directly to negotiations involving tribute, cessation of hostilities, or confirmation of vassal status. In several documented systems, especially within imperial structures in Eurasia, such arrangements were framed as marital alliances. However, legal codes and administrative records reveal that their lived reality frequently resembled institutionalized captivity under controlled privilege, rather than autonomous marriage. Their mobility, correspondence, and social interactions were regulated by palace authorities, and their primary political value lay in their ability to represent the submission or cooperation of their origin polity. Surviving documents suggest that upon arrival at foreign courts, these women were often integrated into hierarchical palace systems that were tightly regulated. Such systems typically included layers of surveillance carried out by court officials, attendants, and in some cases eunuch administrations tasked with controlling access to inner residential spaces. The intent was not merely ceremonial organization, but the prevention of unauthorized alliances, the monitoring of lineage production, and the containment of potential political leverage that could emerge through familial ties. In many imperial courts, lineage and reproduction were not private matters but strategic assets, and women introduced through diplomatic arrangements were situated at the center of this strategic framework. The term bride in these contexts can be misleading when interpreted through later cultural lenses. While some individuals did enter formalized marital unions with rulers or high-ranking officials, others were placed in concubinage systems or court service roles where marital status was ambiguous and intentionally flexible. Historical patterns show that such ambiguity served political purposes, allowing courts to adjust the status of these women, depending on shifting alliances or internal power struggles. A woman initially received as part of a diplomatic agreement could be elevated, marginalized, or confined without formal external accountability, depending on the needs of the ruling authority. Within these systems, punishment was not always immediate or visibly dramatic, but it was structurally embedded in the mechanisms of court life. Legal codes of the period reveal that accusations such as disloyalty, improper communication with external agents, failure to produce heirs, or involvement in factional disputes could result in severe consequences. These consequences varied widely across time and region, but commonly included isolation within restricted quarters, loss of status, forced religious or ritual seclusion, and in certain documented cases, execution following court-approved judgments. The severity of punishment was often tied less to individual action in a modern legal sense and more to the perceived political threat posed by the individual's origin or connections. Chroniclers noted that the position of a woman brought into court through diplomatic exchange was inherently unstable. Even when treated with outward privilege, such as access to servants, fine clothing, or proximity to elite spaces, her security depended entirely on the stability of the political agreement that had brought her there. If relations between states deteriorated, or if a faction within the court sought to undermine the alliance she represented, her status could rapidly shift from protected figure to controlled liability. In such cases, historical patterns suggest that courts often responded by tightening surveillance, restricting movement, or removing the individual from public visibility altogether. The punitive dimension of these systems becomes clearer when examining how courts manage perceived breaches of trust. In several imperial traditions, accusations related to sexual conduct, espionage, or unauthorized communication carried disproportionately severe consequences when directed at women of diplomatic origin. This was not necessarily because of evidence-based legal reasoning, but because these individuals were seen as embodied extensions of foreign influence. As a result, Punishment functioned simultaneously as discipline and as a political signal to both domestic and foreign audiences. In some recorded instances across different empires, removal from court life did not necessarily mean return to the place of origin. Diplomatic realities often made return impossible or undesirable, particularly if the originating polity had been weakened, dissolved, or absorbed. Consequently, exile could take the form of relocation to remote provincial estates, religious institutions, or guarded settlements where the individual remained under state supervision. These forms of exile were effectively a continuation of controlled containment, designed to neutralize political risk while avoiding the diplomatic consequences of execution or repatriation. Historical interpretation of these systems emphasizes that punishment was rarely random. Instead, it followed recognizable patterns aligned with the priorities of state security and dynastic continuity. Women placed into courts through diplomatic exchange occupied a paradoxical position. They were simultaneously symbols of alliance and potential vectors of instability. Their bodies, lineage potential, and political associations were all factors that courts monitored closely, and any perceived deviation from expected behavior could be reframed as a threat to state order. Over time, as imperial bureaucracies became more complex, these mechanisms of control became increasingly codified. Administrative manuals from various traditions describe protocols for managing foreign-born women within palace environments, including restrictions on movement, communication protocols, and procedures for investigating allegations of misconduct. These documents do not always describe punishment in emotional terms, but they reveal a consistent logic of containment, where deviation from prescribed roles was treated as a matter of political risk management rather than personal morality. In examining these systems collectively, historical records indicate that the punishment awaiting prisoners taken as bride offerings was not a singular fate, but a spectrum of controlled outcomes shaped by political necessity. Whether through confinement, status reduction, exile, or execution, the underlying principle remained consistent: the transformation of diplomatic individuals into managed assets of the state, whose value and vulnerability were determined by the shifting landscape of power rather than any stable legal or personal identity. Within this broader framework of diplomatic human exchange, the mechanisms of punishment associated with women placed into foreign courts became most visible during moments of political rupture. Historical records indicate that the stability of such individuals was directly tied to the durability of interstate agreements, meaning that any breakdown in diplomacy could immediately reclassify them from protected political instruments to liabilities, requiring containment or elimination. In several documented imperial systems, this transition was not treated as exceptional, but as an anticipated risk within the logic of governance itself. Surviving administrative correspondence from multiple ancient courts suggests that surveillance around these individuals intensified significantly during periods of diplomatic tension. Court officials responsible for internal security were instructed to monitor correspondence, personal associations, and even patterns of movement within palace complexes. The rationale behind such measures was not solely moral suspicion, but an administrative concern with preventing the formation of alternative power networks. Even informal relationships could be interpreted as conduits for external influence, particularly when the individual originated from a rival or recently subjugated polity. Contemporary accounts describe how accusations in these environments often followed a procedural rather than evidentiary logic. Allegations of disloyal communication, ritual impurity, or inappropriate contact with envoys or servants could trigger formal inquiries conducted by palace authorities. These inquiries were typically internal, conducted within the framework of court jurisdiction, and did not require external validation. The burden of proof was frequently subordinate to political necessity, especially when the accused individual represented a fragile or recently renegotiated alliance. Legal codes of the period reveal that punishment in such cases could take multiple forms, depending on the perceived severity of the breach and the political value of maintaining or severing ties with the originating state. In less severe cases, individuals could be confined to restricted quarters within the palace complex, often under strict isolation protocols. This form of containment functioned both as punishment and as precaution, limiting any possibility of communication while preserving the individual as a potential diplomatic asset for future negotiations. More severe outcomes involved removal from court life entirely. Historical patterns show that such removals were often framed as administrative reassignment rather than punitive exile, although the lived effect was effectively punitive in nature. Individuals could be transferred to remote estates under imperial supervision, religious institutions with strict enclosure rules, or provincial residences where communication with the central court was heavily restricted. In these environments, their political identity was gradually diminished, and their presence became a controlled reminder of prior diplomatic arrangements that had lost relevance. Chroniclers noted that the psychological and social dimensions of such displacement were significant, though recorded in restrained language. Transition from a central court environment where symbolic value and visibility were high to peripheral confinement often resulted in complete loss of agency over personal status. However, historical documentation rarely frames this in individual terms. Instead, it emphasizes the administrative rationale of preventing political instability and limiting the circulation of sensitive lineage claims. In certain imperial contexts, particularly where succession politics were highly contested, the presence of women associated with foreign diplomacy could become a focal point of internal factional struggle. Competing court groups might reinterpret their status as evidence of loyalty or betrayal, depending on shifting alliances. As a result, punishment could be politically instrumentalized. Cassations were sometimes deployed not only to discipline individuals, but also to weaken rival factions that had supported their introduction into the court. Historical records suggest that in these situations, the boundary between legal punishment and political elimination was often blurred. While formal executions did occur in some documented systems, they were typically preceded by processes that framed the outcome as judicial necessity. These processes might involve ritualized hearings, consultation among senior officials, or invocation of established statutes related to treason, espionage, or moral transgression. However, modern scholarly interpretation emphasizes that such procedures operated within a political environment where outcomes were heavily influenced by court dynamics rather than independent judicial reasoning. The concept of foreignness played a central role in determining vulnerability within these systems. Individuals brought into courts through diplomatic exchange were frequently categorized not only by their personal status, but also by their symbolic association with external powers. This association could not be easily dissolved, even over time, which meant that their presence remained politically sensitive, regardless of behavior. Historical interpretation of administrative records shows that even long-term residence within a court did not fully neutralize this perception, particularly during crises. In some cases, punishment extended beyond the individual to include associated attendants, servants, or household members who had accompanied them into court. These secondary figures were often subject to parallel surveillance and could be implicated in broader accusations of conspiracy or unauthorized communication. The structure of palace administration meant that guilt in such contexts was often distributed across networks rather than assigned solely to individuals. This approach reinforced the perception that diplomatic entrance represented collective political risk rather than isolated persons. Historical sources also indicate that ritual and symbolic practices sometimes accompanied punitive measures. While interpretations vary across regions, certain court traditions incorporated formalized ceremonies of status removal, in which titles were revoked and insignia were taken away. These acts served to publicly reclassify the individual's position within the hierarchy, signaling both internal discipline and external political recalibration. The emphasis was not on emotional expression, but on administrative clarity, ensuring that all members of the court understood the altered status and its implications. Despite the severity of these systems, it is important to note that not all outcomes were uniformly punitive. Some individuals successfully navigated court politics and maintained stable positions for extended periods, occasionally even gaining influence within palace networks. However, historical records indicate that such outcomes were exceptions rather than the norm, and even these positions remained contingent on broader diplomatic stability. Change in regime, succession, or foreign relations could rapidly destabilize previously secure standings. The broader diplomatic system that produced these arrangements was fundamentally built on the principle of embodied trust. Rather than relying solely on written treaties, states often embedded guarantees of compliance within human relationships, using marriage or concubinage structures as living extensions of political agreement. This meant that when agreements failed, the individuals representing those agreements were frequently the first to experience consequences. Their vulnerability was structural, not incidental, embedded within the very design of interstate relations. Over time, As imperial bureaucracies evolved and diplomatic practices became more formalized, some regions gradually reduced reliance on such personal exchanges. However, historical continuity shows that the underlying logic of using human intermediaries to stabilize political relationships persisted in various forms for centuries. Even as administrative sophistication increased, the tension between symbolic alliance and enforced control remained a defining feature of these systems. In examining the punitive dimension of these arrangements, historical interpretation emphasizes that punishment was less an isolated act of retribution and more an integrated component of governance. It functioned as a tool for maintaining hierarchical stability, managing foreign influence, and reinforcing the credibility of diplomatic commitments. Within this framework, the individuals placed at the center of these exchanges occupied a position of permanent conditionality, where protection and punishment were not opposites but alternating expressions of the same political logic. In the final phase of examining these diplomatic human exchange systems, historical patterns indicate that the long-term consequences extended far beyond the immediate court environment. Individuals introduced into foreign courts through marriage-based diplomacy often became enduring markers of political relationships that had already shifted or dissolved. Even after treaties were renegotiated or alliances replaced, their presence continued to embody prior political realities, creating what some historians describe as living residues of obsolete agreements. This condition shaped how punishment, containment, and eventual removal were conceptualized within state administration. Surviving documents suggest that as imperial governance became more centralized, authorities increasingly treated these individuals not as temporary diplomatic instruments, but as permanent administrative concerns. Their status was often recorded in bureaucratic registries that tracked lineage, origin, and political affiliation across extended periods. This archival persistence meant that even when their active political relevance declined, their existence remained documented as part of the state's institutional memory, reinforcing the idea that diplomatic exchange created obligations that extended indefinitely. In several historically documented systems, especially those with strong bureaucratic traditions, the question of what to do with such individuals after diplomatic breakdowns became a recurring administrative issue. If repatriation was politically infeasible and continued residence within the court was deemed a security risk, authorities often resorted to controlled disappearance from central records through relocation to distant provinces or enclosed institutions. These measures were not always framed as punishment in explicit terms, but rather as administrative resolution of residual diplomatic obligations. Chroniclers noted that the most severe outcomes were typically reserved for cases where individuals became focal points of factional conflict or were perceived to embody ongoing foreign influence during periods of instability. In such circumstances, punishment was not merely reactive but preventive. The objective was to eliminate potential catalysts for internal division. Legal codes of the period reveal that charges such as conspiracy, ritual violation, or unauthorized correspondence were sufficiently broad to encompass a wide range of behaviors, allowing courts significant flexibility in determining outcomes. Historical interpretation emphasizes that execution, where it occurred, was generally embedded within formal judicial frameworks rather than arbitrary violence. Proceedings were often documented, at least in principle, through advisory councils or senior court officials who validated the necessity of such measures. However, modern scholarship consistently highlights that these procedures operated within environments where political survival often depended on alignment with dominant court factions, meaning that judicial neutrality was structurally limited. In less extreme but more common scenarios, individuals were subjected to progressive forms of erasure from court life. This could include removal of titles, prohibition of attendance at ceremonial events, and reassignment to roles that minimized visibility. Over time, such measures effectively dissolved their political identity without requiring formal punitive acts. Historical records describe this as a gradual loss of place, a condition in which administrative existence persisted while social and political presence was systematically reduced. The broader implications of these practices reveal a governance model in which human beings function simultaneously as diplomatic assets and potential liabilities. The same individual could be viewed as a guarantee of peace during one political phase and as a security threat during another. This duality was not incidental but embedded in the structural logic of interstate relations, where personal identity was subordinated to political function. In this sense, Punishment cannot be understood solely as a response to transgression, but as an adaptive mechanism within a system designed to manage unstable alliances. Contemporary accounts also suggest that the emotional or psychological experiences of these individuals, while rarely centered in official records, were indirectly visible through references to isolation, restricted mobility, and enforced silence. However, administrative language consistently reframed these conditions in terms of order maintenance and risk control. The absence of personal narrative in official documentation is itself significant, reflecting a bureaucratic worldview in which individual subjectivity was secondary to institutional stability. Over time, as diplomatic systems evolved and states developed more standardized treaty mechanisms, the reliance on human exchange as a binding instrument gradually declined in some regions. Nevertheless, the legacy of these practices persisted in institutional memory and influenced later forms of political confinement, court exile, and regulated residence. The structural principle remained recognizable. Individuals associated with political transition points were often retained within systems of controlled visibility, ensuring that past agreements could be managed without destabilizing present governance. Historical synthesis of these patterns indicates that the punishment awaiting prisoners taken as bride offerings in ancient diplomacy was not a singular or uniform experience, but a layered continuum shaped by shifting political needs. At one end of the spectrum lay privileged integration under surveillance, and at the other, permanent removal through exile or judicial execution. Between these extremes existed a wide range of controlled conditions that gradually reduced agency while maintaining administrative oversight. Across all variations, the defining feature remained consistent: the transformation of personal identity into a regulated extension of state diplomacy. Seen through a broader analytical lens, these systems illustrate how ancient governance often fused domestic authority with foreign policy through embodied relationships. Individuals placed at the center of these arrangements were neither purely private persons nor purely political symbols, but hybrid entities whose existence was continuously reinterpreted according to state necessity. Punishment, therefore, functioned less as an isolated corrective act and more as an ongoing administrative process embedded within the life cycle of diplomatic relations themselves.